which render it more agreeable to the palate, and in the case of fine wines impart bouquet and even sève. Another cause of variation in the character of wines is the deposition, in whole or in part, of various substances on the walls of the cask, or in the form of lees at the bottom, that are thus eliminated from the composition of the wine. These young wines, compared with their condition at maturity, are more heavy-bodied, more deeply colored, green or acid, more astringent carrot, and sometimes rough and harsh. These wines are, finally, more nutritious than after they become mature. It must not be forgotten, however, that a wine which is too young is somewhat indigestible. Green, Verdi, Verdetto, Bruscetto, Vert, Agrilet, Father. Green wine is not synonymous with young wine, as might be supposed at first. Greenness is a quality which a new wine may and generally does have. A wine is said to be green when it has an acidity and roughness, which, though pronounced, is of such a character that it will disappear with time. Thus, incompletely ripened grapes give a green wine, owing to a small quantity of volatile acid and acid salts which they contain, and more especially by tartrate of potash. Greenness is characteristic of certain new wines, and also of many mature wines produced in northern countries. Tart, acidulo, acidetto, acidule, agrilet, Father. Said of a wine possessing an agreeable and sufficient acidity, due to the presence of free tartaric acid and sometimes of carbonic acid, especially when this latter is in such amount as to become free easily, and so affect sensibly the tip of the tongue. Harshly acid, acerbo, acerb, Father. Expresses a sharp, harsh acidity, like that in sour or unripe fruit, which puts the teeth on edge. 42 Wine and the art of wine tasting, and draws up the lips and mouth. This acidity comes from immature seeds or green stems, which communicate their acids, such as malic, racemic, etc., to the wine. In other words, the acid is the same chemistry as that found in unripe fruit. Wine produced from grapes which for some cause or other have not reached their maturity, are always more or less harshly acid. With time this repellent acidity disappears, for the reason, according to Dessins, that the malic acid, after 8 or 10 months, decomposes into succinic and butyric acids. F. Mature wine, vino maturo, vinmur. Father. A mature wine is one which has quite developed all its characteristic qualities, and which is therefore ready to be drunk, or to be placed in bottles, where, in aging, it will go on improving. Decrepit wine, vino decrepito, passato, vin. Pass, affiably, Father. The caducity of a wine is the stage, according to Dr. Guyot, where it has past its prime maturity, and when it has already commenced to deteriorate, when, in other words, it has lost some or all of the qualities due to its volatile principles and other constituents. A decrepit wine has lost its fragrance, has become flat, it has not contracted any disagreeable or repelling flavor, for the taste of age that these wines have cannot be called disagreeable in the same sense as a wine which is attacked by the disease called bitterness, but it has a slight bitterness which recalls that of some resinous substances. These wines, when they find themselves in favorable conditions, as when exposed to the air, decompose readily. A wine which has been exposed to the cold of winter and the heat of summer acquires in the month of September the taste which Italians call settembrino, which is exhausted and pass. M. Salvini. Dryj. Vino assaiuto, it. Vin sec, father. This is said of a wine which leaves in the mouth a sense of dryness. It is a characteristic of highly alcoholic and somewhat astringent wines. Pomino. Leaves the mouth dry, say the Tuscans. A dry wine is not only without even the slightest taste of glucose, but it does not contain, or only in the most minute degree, the quality of smoothness due to a certain quantity of glycerin. And, in the case of high-class wines, of other substances. Astringent, asprito, it. Un pu. Dpre, father. When the tannin is somewhat noticeable. This acidity must not be confounded with that due to the acetification of the wine. This excessive acidity may be amended by an indirect method, which is that suggested by gall, and which aims to correct the must before fermentation. Or some may have recourse to memorization, that is, the addition to the wine of powdered calcium carbonate, marble, which is, however, a method which cannot be very highly recommended, and when necessary, Liebig's method is much to be preferred. This method is to add to the wine a concentrated solution of neutral tartrate of potash in such proportion as to bring down the acidity to the desired degree. As a preliminary test, to ascertain with an approximation near enough for practical purposes, several quart bottles are filled with the wine to be treated. And to each bottle is added a certain quantity of the solution of neutral tartrate of potash, each bottle being given a slightly greater dose than the one before. The bottles are then corked and left to themselves for a few days. They are then tasted, and the one giving the desired result is used as the basis of calculation for treating the whole quantity. The organic acids contained in the must are the following: tartaric, racemic, malic, citric, tannic, palmitic, stearic, etc. The acids, on the other hand, which are produced by fermentation, the oxidation of the alcohol, or the breaking up of the sugar, are carbonic, acetic, propionic, butyric, valerianic, capronic, genanthelic, pelargonic, succaic, lactic, etc. This is a restricted use of the term dry, somewhat different from its more general meaning, which is simply not sweet, that is, containing no glucose. Trans. Wine and the art of wine tasting. 43. Rough, austro, pavido, alapant, it. Ostia. Apra, picotant, father. These terms are used of wines which, on account of their excess of tannin, or rather enotannin, are in the highest degree rough and astringent. Their flavor, which is somewhat nauseous, recalls immediately that of ink, or of ferruginous substances. In drinking a rough, over-astringent wine, a feeling of dryness is produced on the tongue and along the esophagus. The daily use of wines of this character, by persons of delicate constitution, may occasion organic disorders. This roughness tends to diminish with time, and may completely disappear, the cause being that the tannin, under the influence of oxygen, gives place to a slow \V formation of carbonic and gallic acids. Enotannin * possesses tonic properties, and ensures the conservation of the wine by causing coagulation, and consequently the elimination of many substances which the wine contains, substances whose presence is dangerous from their instability, and because they favor the development of those organisms to which are due secondary fermentations. High-class and fine wines when young, and even sometimes when old, are more or less markedly rough. This roughness they lose with time. Harsh, duro, father. Harsh wines are generally young wines, rich in tartar and tannin, and which, consequently, leave a repellent impression on the papillae of the tongue and palate. Harsh wines are lacking in delicacy and value. Harshness, of itself, is a defect. Ordinarily it is due to the soil, and in that case the wine is also heavy-bodied. This defect may also be owing to unskillful preparation or handling. Harsh wines keep easily, and can be kept for a longer or shorter time, according to their quality. Inotannin has the property of forming with gelatine and with albumin volumin. Aus insoluble compounds, nig precipitate with great readiness. By means of clarify cation, therefore, Tne contents of senotannin can be notably diminished, thus curing, or at least considerably lessening, the defect of roughness. I have called roughness a defect, but that should be understood relatively, not absolutely, for it should not be forgotten that the general trade demands a certain roughness, and wines in which it is lacking are often given this character artificially by the addition of alum, which is undeniably an adulteration, or by the addition of tannin. Alum is used by unprincipled dealers, and has the quality of reviving the color, precipitating the albuminoids, and imparting a roughness, almost styptic, analogous to that presented by the common Bordeaux wines. The winemaker has the choice of two kinds of tannin which are found in commerce, and which differ in their mode of extraction or preparation. Thus, the tannin may be extracted from galls by means of ether, giving a tannin pure, but retaining a taste of ether, which renders it objectionable in the treatment of wine. The other kind, which is extracted by alcohol, is inodorous, and therefore preferable for the winemaker. Pure tannin dissolves completely in alcohol, and in water mixed with 10% of alcohol, and the solution should be limpid. When the winemaker needs tannin, he can make use of the grape seeds, which contain a considerable quantity. The seeds may be used either fresh or dry, the latter being more convenient, as they can be preserved from year to year. It is to be remarked that clarification attempted with isinglass, gelatine, or white of egg, does not always succeed. The failure is due to the lack or insufficiency of tannin in the wine, or to its superabundance. This explains the common usage of adding tannin to white wines before attempting to clarify them, or in the case of highly tannic red wines why, after adding the clarify cation, it is often necessary, in order to produce perfect limpidity, to have recourse to sulfuring and racking. This is what the cellarman means when he says that the wine has not taken the finings. Wines which have fermented slowly, and which contain substances resembling humic compounds, can sometimes be fined even when lacking in tannin. It is also worthy of remark that tannin has a great influence on the color of wine. It tends to increase it, and, according to M. Nessler, if the wine remains for some time in contact with the lees, it prevents, to a great extent, the diminution of the color. 44. Wine and the art of wine tasting. The life of ordinary or common wines, which are harsh, is limited to a few, 2 or 3, years. These wines in losing their harshness gain little or nothing in value, in fact, as they lose the defect of harshness. They acquire another, that due to tartaric fermentation. Harsh wines which have good quality and body keep for a long time, and after some years lose their harshness. They thus become more homogeneous, harmonious, and pleasing, or as the experts express it, they become rounded. If these wines are drunk before they have lost a portion of their harshness, they are not very hygienic. Bitterish, amarognolo, un penamere, father. This is not a defect. It is even up to a certain point a good quality, that is, when the bitterness is very slight, delicate, aromatic, in short, pleasing. As a rule, a slight touch of bitterness is characteristic of densely colored wines. Very often this quality is due to the presence of carbonic acid in solution, for example, in young wines or those which have been treated by the Italian method called il govno. Sometimes, in the common language, all wines are called bitter, but with impropriety, which are not sweet, from which the Tuscan proverb vino amaro tian lo caro, which means, the wine which is not sweet is always of best quality. Bitter, amaro, amia, father. Bitterness is a defect, and may be due, as in general it is, to a real malady caused by a microorganism. El amatumist pour nous la maladie organique des vins de Pinot. Vernet Lamet. Wines of this kind have a harsh, repelling, nauseating bitterness, due to secondary fermentations, or in the case of young wines, to principles which they have extracted from the skins or stalks during fermentation. According to M. Nessler, the tendency of a wine to this disease is augmented by remaining long in contact with the pomace. The bitter taste affects principally the posterior portions of the tongue and palate, and the sensation persists for some time. This fault, which most cenologists consider confined to red wine, is found also, we are told by M. Ottavi, in white wines. He claims to have encountered it in the white wines of Piedmont. Nessler observes that white wines are less subject to this defect or malady than red, thus admitting, by implication, that they do sometimes become bitter. The bitter secondary fermentation may develop in any wine, but is more frequent in fine and delicate wines. In common wines the disease usually occurring is the tartaric fermentation. In general, highly colored wines, rich in extractive matters, are most liable to the attacks of the disease of bitterness. The high-class wines of Bourgogne, made from the peanut, not excluded, in even those made in the most favorable years, are subject to attack by this disease. In the finest wines Vernet Lamet distinguishes two kinds of bitterness, that which attacks the wine during the first 2 or 3 years of its life, and which is the most dangerous, and that which shows itself. 2. Govno is a method of wine treatment in common use in Tuscany, which consists essentially in maintaining a slow, protracted fermentation in a poor or neutral wine by the addition of half-dried grapes of high quality, or containing an abundance of those substances lacking in the wine treated, as color, body, tannin, etc. Trans. Wine and the art of wine tasting. 45. In old and decrepit wines, this second bitterness, due perhaps more to chemical reactions than to the action of ferments, is only relatively an ill, as the wine can be consumed before it reaches complete decrepitude. Tastier holds that even this second bitterness, which Vernet Lammert lays to the account of decrepitude, is caused by the same organism which determines the first kind. This organism may remain inert for a longer or shorter period, till in the course of aging the wine presents the necessary favorable conditions for its development. In conclusion, I will say that the bitter taste is a somewhat serious defect, a defect which may be more or less marked, as it may be transitory or permanent. Asterisk the bitter taste in wine may be the consequence of imperfect maturity of the grapes, owing either to an unpropitious season, or to the damage caused by insect or cryptogamic pests, or it may be the consequence of a secondary fermentation, caused by a microorganism, i.e., the bitter ferment which determines the formation of those substances which impart this taste to the wine. In the latter case we have a true disease. When the bitterness is due to the principles which have passed from the grapes and stems into the wine, then with time and successive finings and rackings it will disappear. This is explained by the supposition that the nitrogenous substances become impregnated with the bitter principles, and thus, when the former are precipitated, they carry along with them the latter, the wine in this way losing this defect. The bitter taste, if very pronounced, may not disappear after the first rackings, in which case the wine should be fined with gelatine or white of egg. If the wine be weak, the coagulation of the albumin may be facilitated by the addition of alcohol. According to the quality of the wine, it may be given a light clarification with the whites of 3 or 4 eggs per hectoliter, or a more energetic treatment with 25 grams of gelatine. Such a treatment not being found sufficient, recourse must be had to the use of olive oil of good quality. Of this the dose to be used is 1/2 liter per hectoliter. The oil is poured into the wine, the whole thoroughly stirred, and then allowed to rest. The oil separates from the wine, and carries with it the substances which have caused the bitterness. Directly after racking a wine with access of air, it will sometimes become slightly bitter. This seems to be caused by the action of the oxygen of the air upon substances contained in the wine. Later the bitterness disappears, owing very probably to the rapid oxidation which causes these substances to precipitate. In this way M. Mona explains how bitter wines in bottles can, with time, lose this defect. Formerly various opinions were held regarding this malady, because, in all probability, people failed to distinguish between bitterness proper and the malady due to tartaric fermentation, or lapis. Thus de Blacy attributed it to changes of the salts, especially of bitartrate of potash, matured to an invisible action of the fermentative principle, decomposing the last rem. Nance of sugar and salts in the wine, led birth to an abnormal fermentation, which produced, sometimes, citric ether, which has a bitter taste. Vernet Lammert to a secondary fermentation, caused by a parasitic vegetation, which decomposed the wine in consuming the coloring matter. Neubauer found that the quantity of tannin and of coloring matter diminished with the progress of the malady. Finally Pasteur, after the study of many bitter wines, has demonstrated that this malady is caused by the action ***2ij I j the Bordelaise. He adds that this malady presents many diversities in its development. According to the origin and the nature of the wine, but that all wines are subject to it. Duclio, in 1873, determined the volatile acids of bitter wines, the following being the result of his analyses. 46 Wine and the art of wine tasting. Earthy taste, terroso, it. Terro, gout de terroi, gout de Piero. Fusel, father. By the term earthy, a single definite taste must not be understood, but divers flavors which are all in general disgusting or bad. In tasting, these flavors are perceived by the posterior part of the mouth, and may have their origin in the soil, in the use of inappropriate fertilizers, in the plants supporting the vines, or in the weeds infesting the vineyard, etc. The earthy taste is a vague term, writes Ottavy, and with justice. For it is a taste which is not always very definite, resembling sometimes earth, manure, flint, slate, nuts, willow, grass, etc. It is well known that Aristolochia, mercuriales, etc., if allowed to grow in the vineyard, communicate their flavor to the grapes, and therefore to the wine. Pliny was not mistaken when he wrote, in general, the vine takes up with an astonishing facility the flavors of neighboring plants. The grapes grown in the marshy soils of Padua have a taste of willow. Generally the earthy taste is not found in high-class or fine wines. I say generally, because there are exceptions. For example, Chablis has a slight flavor of flint, and yet it is a wine of a certain renown. Richelieu, speaking to Louis XV of a certain wine of Graves, said, // Saint La Pierre. Fusel com. Un vieil carabine. The flinty taste, writes Petit Laffitte, has something vinous and energetic, which exactly recalls the sensation experienced by the olfactory organs when a flint recently struck by the steel is held under the nose. The diminution of the glycerin was also pointed out by Pasteur, who, besides, stated that the tartaric acid did not diminish. As the researches of Fritz have shown, many microbes are able to cause fermentation of the glycerin, thus, under the action of the Bacillus butylicus it is transformed into butylic alcohol and butyric acid. Recently, B has experimented with a view of ascertaining whether the bitter taste was due to citric ether, as Miller and other French chemists had supposed, or to some resinous substance produced by changes of the aldehyde in presence of ammoniacal compositions having their origin in the albuminoid matters of the wine. By exhausting a wine which was afflicted with the bitter disease, and which he had previously rendered alkaline with ether, he obtained a resin slightly soluble in water, very soluble in alcohol and in acetic ether, insoluble in carbon bisulfide, turning brown in contact with the alcohols, becoming greenish with ferric chloride, and having the extremely bitter taste of the diseased wine. Hass has found by his experiments that the best way of curing a wine afflicted with this malady is by the use 0,1 oxidizing agents. Oxygenated water in small quantities is inefficacious. In larger quantities it destroys the bitter taste, but produces another not less disgusting. The best results have been obtained by aeration. The wine is fortified by the addition of alcohol till it contains 13% by volume. If of feeble character and liable to acetify, a current of air is then passed through the wine for 2 hours, and the bitterness disappears completely. Filtration through pomace or cellulose has an excellent effect, the bitter substance seeming to be removed by physical attraction. This disease may be said to have several stages. At first the wine is still clear, but less fragrant, duller in color, and with a slight bitter taste. Later it acquires an odor. Sui generis, the bitter taste increases, becoming piquant on account of the small quantity of carbonic acid produced by the secondary fermentation which takes place. Finally, it loses its natural color, becoming brownish, with a tendency to blue. There has then taken place a serious change in one of the principal components of the wine, the extractive matter, and the wine has become an undrinkable liquid. According to Decio, the earthy taste is due probably to the solution and evaporation of a part of the mineral and metallic substances which are found in the soil of certain vineyards. Petit Laffitte seems inclined to attribute the flinty taste to iron and alumina. Ladry, on the other hand, accounts for it by the presence of much silica in the soil. And many analyses show silica not only in the leaves and seeds of the vine, but also in the wine. Julie states that the flinty taste is due to the fact that pyronyac silica contains a bituminous substance of organic origin, the peculiar taste of which is communicated to the wine. It should also be remembered that the experiments of Thénard prove that silicate of lime is much more soluble in water than was formerly believed. Wine and the art of wine tasting. 47. According to the experiments made by Aubergia, the principle to which wines owe their earthy taste is found neither in the seeds nor in the stems, but in the skins of the grapes. From 15 kilograms of pomace he extracted 30 grams of a volatile oil so acrid and penetrating that a single drop was sufficient to infect 10 liters of the best brandy. This fact supports the opinion of those who see in the prolonged contact of the wine with the pomace the cause of the earthy taste. Certainly, by improving the soil, by the use of proper fertilizers, by a good defecation of the must, by a prompt removal of the wine from the pomace, by clarification and rackings, the taste under discussion is much diminished, and sometimes completely eliminated. Taste of soil, sa di terra, it. Gout de terre, father. When the wine has that taste of soil or of clay, due to the presence of soil in the must. During fermentation, the soil in the must may come from the skins of the grapes, which may easily become covered with it when the bunches lie too close to the ground, or may have become mixed with the grapes accidentally or by carelessness. This taste may come, also, from the clay which the peasants sometimes use as cement to close the leaks in tubs, vats, or other utensils. Taste of brine, salt, sal di salmastro, di salso, it. Gout de saumtre. De sale, father. The wine has sometimes the taste of common or culinary salt. This defect is found in wines grown in soil rich in salt, or in localities near the sea. Cooked taste, sal di cotto, it. Gout de kit, father. If the wine has a taste more or less pronounced of must or caramel, due generally to the action of fire upon the must when the latter has been concentrated carelessly, or by direct heat. This taste is caused, also, by an overmaturity of the grapes, as happens in very hot weather, and especially when the grapes are thick-skinned. It may be caused, also, by frozen grapes, or by the freezing of the wine, in the latter case especially when the pieces of ice formed in the wine are not carefully removed. Resinous taste, sal di resina, it. Gout de resine, father. This taste is found in wines which have been kept in receptacles made of resinous wood. Bread taste, sa di pain, it. Gout de pain, father. Some sweet liquor. Wines have an agreeable taste which reminds one of the odor of fresh bread. Taste of drugs, medicinal taste, sa di droia, it. Gout de drogues. Father. A taste due to the addition of some infusion or drug to the wine. Regarding the quantity of silica contained in wine, we have the analyses of Bassin Galt, who, in analyzing his wine grown at Smallberg, Base Rhin, found 6.096 gr of silica per 1.870 gr of ash in a gallon of wine, 5% of the mineral ingredients. Grasso, in the ash of 4 different musts, found the following quantities of silica. Petit Bourgogne, not mature, 1.991%. Petit Bourgogne, mature, 2.099%. Petit Bourgogne, mature, but from a different soil, 1.191%. Gruyère Sylvaner, white, mature, 2.181%. In the skins the proportion was greater, in those of the first it was 3.464, and 2.571 in those of the fourth. That a drop of this oil is capable of infecting so large a quantity of brandy is not wonderful, when we reflect on the sensibility of our organism, especially of our sense of smell, which is so susceptible as to surpass the extremely delicate spectroscope. Thus, for example, Valentin has shown that 1/500,000th of a milligram of sulfhydric acid, or 1/2,000,000th of a milligram of essence of roses, is sufficient to make an impression on our olfactory organs. 48 Wine and the art of wine tasting. Burnt taste, sa di abruciato, it. Gout de brûle. Father. When the wine has a flavor of acrid fruit, together with a spurious cooked taste, the taste of which we speak is a consequence of the partial withering of the grapes before their maturity, on account of extreme heat or of great changes of temperature between night and day. Mousy taste, sa di topo it, gout de souris, father. A wine will sometimes have a disgusting flavor and odor that recalls forcibly the odor of the excrements of mice. The cause of this defect is not well known. According to some authorities, it is due to lack of cleanliness in the receptacles in which the wine is kept. Others believe it to be caused by the action of the oxygen of the air on the extractive matter of the wine, for there seems sometimes to be a distant analogy between the mousy taste and the fresh bread taste so much appreciated in some liquors. It is very probable that both of these causes concur to produce this taste, for it is found sometimes even in wines which have been kept in glass. The mousy taste may be more or less intense, and wines affected produce a dry feeling in the mouth when they are tasted. If a wine has this taste in a very slight degree, it is not noticed immediately. It often happens that after passing judgment on a wine, one's opinion has to be modified by a mousy taste which is not perceived at first. If the defect is pronounced, it is perceived immediately by the nose. The odor and taste too, in this case, are so disgusting as to be sickening. Heated taste, sa di recaldato, it. Gout de réchauffe, father. This unpleasant flavor is hard to define, as, in fact, it is a mixture of various flavors of acetic acid, of stems, of organic matter slightly decaying, under the influence of heat and moisture, etc. This taste is easily produced by allowing the cap to become overheated during fermentation, or by heating grapes before crushing them. With time this taste tends to disappear, but when somewhat pronounced it diminishes, leaving the wine with a somewhat acrid taste. Sulfur smell, or better, smell of sulfhydric acid. An odor resembling rotten eggs which a wine may have, and which is due to the presence of sulfhydric acid or sulfated hydrogen. ***. Taste of stale eggs, sa diu over stantal, it. Gout dof gate, father. This taste, which is easier to avoid than to cure, comes from the use of eggs not perfectly fresh for fining. Odor of sulfurous acid, or of sulfur vapor. A wine often has the odor characteristic of this substance when it has been recently racked into an excessively sulfured cask. As everyone knows, things that are useful when used in moderation become dangerous when used in excess. This is the case with sulfur acid. It is generally held that the cause of the formation of sulfhydric acid in the wine is the presence of sulfur in the fermenting mass, as happens when the vines have been sulfured in such a way as to allow sulfur to adhere to the grapes. This is indeed the principal cause, but not the only one. Nessler cites 6 of these causes, which are the sulfuring of the vines, the sulfuring of casks, the use of sulfur tape, the use of certain fertilizers, the cultivation of the vines in certain soils, the presence of iron in the vats or casks. To these causes, most probably, should be added another, that of the reduction of fats by microorganisms, a reduction first noticed by Blanchard, who attributed it to vital action. This action has been found by Attard and Olivier to be due to algs of the group of oscillators, called Beggiato, B. roseopicina, B. mirabilis, B. alba. Other algae of the genus Eulothrix have the same property. Is it not possible that microorganisms might be found in wine resembling and acting in the same way as these algs found in sulfurous waters? Wine and the art of wine tasting. 49. The fine experiments of Duboeuf and J. Brull on the action of sulfurous anhydride, or acid, on microorganisms, have an important bearing here. They have deduced from their experiments the following conclusions. 1. Sulfurous acid gas has an evident microbicidal action on the germs contained in the air. 2. This action is especially perceptible when the air is saturated with water vapor. 3. Sulfurous acid acts particularly on the germs of bacteria. 4. Pure sulfurous acid will destroy germs, even in the dry state, if the action is sufficiently prolonged. Sulfurous acid, when used in excessive quantities, takes away from the quality and color of the wine, and gives it a bitterish, astringent, and displeasing taste. In time the sulfurous acid changes to sulfuric, and then into sulfate of potassium. This is why in many wines is found a certain quantity of this sulfate, which is dangerous to health, and, when sufficient of it is present, would lead to the belief that the wine had been plastered. At the end of the last century it was shown that a wine sulfured to excess acquired a very disagreeable odor, and was hurtful to the health, causing headache, vertigo, oppression of the stomach, nausea, etc. In practice it is good to remember that the more alcoholic a wine, the more sulfurous acid it will dissolve or absorb. Nessler, making a comparison of water and wine at 9% of alcohol, filled a barrel quickly with each, after having burned as much sulfur as the air in the barrel would consume, and found that the water absorbed 0.01035% of sulfurous acid, and the wine 0.01346%. The quantity of sulfurous acid which a wine will absorb in process of keeping cannot be exactly stated, as it depends on the number of sulphurings, the amount of sulfur burned, or, when the sulfur is burned directly in the cask, on the amount of oxygen there. According to Weigert, the quantity of oxygen in a cask of 1 hectoliter is 21 liters or 30 grams. By burning an equal quantity of sulfur, 60 grams of sulfurous acid are formed. When the cask is filled, all this is not dissolved, because part is oxidized immediately, and part escapes into the air as the wine enters the cask. Thus, the total amount absorbed by the wine is reduced to about 10 or 11 grams. Various odors: violet, rose, mignonette, pink, bitter almonds, etc. These are all odors given artificially to the wine to render it more fragrant, or to attempt to pass it off as a wine of higher quality than it really is. Many high-class and fine wines, in aging, develop characteristic bouquets, but besides bouquet these wines have sève, which artificially perfumed wines lack altogether or have little of in proportion to their fragrance. Besides the odors which we call good, which have been added artificially, we have also bad odors which are absorbed from the air by the grapes or the wine, such as the odor of tobacco, of grass, etc. Wood taste: sapore di legno, assaiuto. Sal di secco, it. Saveur de bois. Sèche, gout de sec, farther. A taste not easily defined, as it lies somewhere between that of wood and of mold. It is communicated to the wine by ill-kept casks which have become secco, assaiuto, a defect seeming to 450 wine and the art of wine tasting be due to the development of mold in the inside of the cask. Sometimes wine will acquire this taste when left long with ullage or in imperfectly closed casks. To remove this taste recourse is had to olive oil, lemons, or a fermentation with a small quantity of fresh grapes. Essi sapia di secco, il vino, 6 abbia odor cattivo, catch in visi dentro. Fiacolacus, e6 si spengano soderini. Taste of the stems. This is a rude, unpleasant taste, vulgarly known as a taste of legno verde, green wood. It is found in wines which have been allowed a too prolonged contact with the stems, or which have been made by a maceration of the whole bunch, or which have been made from bunches not perfectly sound. The taste of stems is generally accompanied by some bitterness. Clarifications and rackings with contact of the air will often destroy or notably diminish the stem taste. When it is desired to prolong the contact of the wine with the pomace, stemming is to be recommended. Smoky taste. This taste resembles the smell of burning wet or green wood. It is, writes Mona, somewhat acrid and bitter, recalling smoke and soot. According to Mona, it is found more rarely in Italian wines than in German. This defect may be occasioned by the smoke given off by ill-constructed stoves used to heat the fermenting room or cellar, or it may be due to Unfavorable climatic conditions during the vintage. It has been stated that musts corrected by the addition of cane sugar will sometimes give wines with this taste. With the smoky taste, a wine loses its brightness, becomes cloudy, and, if not cured by sulfuring, changes into a liquid not to be tolerated by even the most uncritical palate. Oak taste. A taste which a wine will contract after 2 or 3 rackings into new casks which have not been properly prepared, especially if they are made of a bad quality of wood. The wine in this case acquires a peculiar, bitterish taste, according to Ottavie, almost aromatic. Much tannin, and often the real flavor of the wine is quite destroyed. Taste of mercaptan. The repugnant taste and odor of onions or garlic, which remains even after the wine has been racked into well sulfured casks. The same causes which tend to produce hydrogen sulfide in the wine, not excepting plastering when it is done heavily, tend also to form mercaptan. So far no means have been discovered of removing this taste from wine. Polexi was the first to observe the formation of these products, which have a fetid and persistent odor, and are due to the action of sulfhydric acid and sulfur on the components of the must and wine. He believes them to be simply ethylic mercaptan. Koenig thinks that this reaction is not very probable, as it has never been known to take place in a dilute acid solution. He believes, on the contrary, that the aldehyde contained in most wines combines easily and directly in a dilute acid solution with sulfhydric acid to form the aldehyde and trithealdehyde. Now these compounds are endowed with a strong, persistent, and disagreeable odor, resembling closely that acquired by wines containing sulfhydric acid. It may be, therefore, that the mercaptanic wine and the art of wine tasting. 51. Substance spoken of by Polexi is nothing but thioaldehyde or trithealdehyde. Taste of lees. Wine, by a prolonged contact with the lees, loses its clean taste and acquires a more or less pronounced bitterness, which has a distant resemblance to a taste of decay, and is characteristic of lees even when sound. Taste of decay, sapor di fradicio, it. Savor de porri, father. A taste which the wine contracts from unsound cooperage or too prolonged contact with the lees. It is a repelling taste of rottenness, which, however, must not be confounded with that caused by putrid fermentation of the wine. This taste may also originate in imperfectly ripened grapes, which, through the prolonged action of dampness, have commenced to decay. If the grapes are ripe before they commence to decay, the wine will still have something of this taste, but it will be less disgusting and will tend to disappear with time. The wine will, however, always be insipid and lack frankness of taste. Moldy taste. The characteristic taste of mold. Wines easily contract this taste, either from moldy casks or from moldy grapes having been used. It is generally possible to take away this taste by the use of olive oil. Sapor di tempesta, it. Savor dugdal, father a harsh, bitterish, what moldy taste, perceived in wine made from grapes that have been injured by hail at the commencement of their ripening. Rancid, rancido, it. Roni, father. When the wine is swallowed, or whilst it is being drunk, a displeasing taste is noticed in the throat and slightly on the palate, almost analogous to that of rancid substances, from which comes the name given to this disease of wine, till now unstudied by any author. The roni can also be smelt, if it is pronounced, but a good nose is needed to discover it, and a delicate palate to taste it, at its incipiency. 0. Ottavi. Fruity tastf. Sapor di frutto, it dot, savor de fruit, father. Many young wines, when well made, have a very pronounced taste of fruit. Common wines, with age, lose this taste, but fine, and above all, the finest wines retain it, much to their advantage. They retain it, however, only when aged slowly, and without the use of artificial aids. Tartaric fermentation. This term is used to cover two different maladies of wine caused by two microorganisms, which differ somewhat from each other, and the products of the fermentations caused by them differ considerably. These maladies, however, have a certain affinity, since both the microorganisms, to whose action they are due, live at the expense of the tartaric acid M, the cream of tartar. The French distinguish these two maladies, calling the first la mala di dell'apus vinpus, in Italian, malattia del subolimento, and the second, maladi della tournes tournes, in Italian, Ciron. It may perhaps be useful to note that the lees may become the seat of a bacteroid fermentation independently of any anterior disease in the wine. Thus, according to the experiments of Ravizza, the wine and lees may become the prey of bacteria without the aid of molds or other microorganisms that destroy the acids. The temperature most favorable to the development of bacteria in the lees seems to be from 77°F to 86°F. Below 77°F, the phenomena accompanying the life of these bacteria decrease, and towards 50°F cease altogether. The practice, then, in racking, of separating the last layers of wine, that is, the part lying in contact with the lees, from the rest is a good one, and this wine may be considered of inferior quality, either because it lacks a clean, fresh taste, or because it is sometimes cloudy. Tea fruity is very often used in English with the inappropriate meaning of somewhat sweet. Trans. 52 WJNE and the art of wine tasting. Malady de l'apus. This disease is recognized by the wine spurting out when the vessel in which it has been confined is opened. The wine exercises a strong pressure on the staves of the cask on account of the carbonic acid which is formed. It is from this that comes the term pus. 7. In the glass the wine shows a persistent ring of small gaseous bubbles of a whitish color. If the wine is left exposed to the air it becomes turbid, its color becomes dull with a tendency to yellowish. The wine has lost its primary flavor, and as the disease progresses, becomes more and more insipid. If it is shaken there is an appearance of silky waves at the surface, caused by the lees which has risen up. Ballard was the first to show the presence in vins pusses of a ferment which, according to him, resembles the lactic ferment. He has further shown that in these wines the quantity of volatile acids is increased, the one found in largest quantity being acetic acid. Bachauip and Stannard have shown that propionic acid is formed in these wines from the tartar and the glycerin. Nichols, on the contrary, is of the opinion that metastatic acid is produced. Duclaws, who has given much attention to this malady, seems to have proved, 1. That the amount of free acids augments with the progress of the malady, 2. That this increase is made at the expense of the fixed acids of the wine, particularly of the tartaric acid, 3. That the acids formed are propionic and acetic. After having shown this, he concludes by saying that all fermentation of the tartar that takes place with the evolution of pure carbonic acid and production of propionic and acetic acids should be called maladied lapis. Zircone, vin gerato, mercurilla, tuon, vin tuon, vin chiadun. Latour, father. At this word in an Italian dictionary is written, zircone. A distiller's term is said of a spoiled wine, because in becoming thus it works and turns, vapor, Laura of the Latins. The Laura of the Latins is certainly not the zircone, but family wine, piquet, neither is vapor. Since that, according to the dictionaries, should indicate a flat, vapid wine. Vapor vinum insipidum et nullino virtutis, post quam omnia no odor. Supporc optimus evaporavit. Vin tuon has this peculiarity, that when first poured out it appears sound, but after a short time it tends to become turbid and iridescent. Under the influence of the oxygen of the air the coloring matter becomes purplish, and precipitates, and the wine acquires a yellowish tint, a sour taste, and a forbidding bitterness. Wines of this kind when distilled give a brandy having a bitter taste, caused probably by ammoniacal compounds. The alcohol made from them has not always, but often, a strong and pungent odor, and cannot, without being well rectified, be put to the ordinary uses of wine alcohol. That is, the manufacture of vermouth, etc. This odor is sometimes so pungent as to bring tears to the eyes, and, by fractional distillations, it is possible to isolate a certain quantity of erotinaldehyde. This compound is formed, very probably, during the distillation by the condensation of the aldehyde with diminution of water. Ballard has found lactic acid in vins tuons, Glenard, on the other. Recently Professor Comboni, in distilling a wine made by blending Marzemino and black peanut, which had been attacked by the bitter fermentation, found in the distillate a considerable amount of aldehyde and formic acid. These products are certainly formed during the progress of the secondary fermentation, for they are not found at all in the same wine and sound. Wine and the art of wine tasting. 53. Hand has found potassic acetate in the secondary fermentation of vins tuons. There is a formation of acetic acid, and more especially of lactic and tartronic acids. A wine attacked by this disease may be considered as lost, however. At the start it may be useful to try the addition of tannin and cream of tartar, then pasteurization and fining. The disease, if not arrested, is followed by putrid fermentation. Putrid fermentation. This disease attacks the organic matter in the wine, destroys it, and gives rise to repulsive tastes and odors. In the incipiency of this fermentation, the repulsive odor and taste are not very marked, and a cure may be attempted by heavy sulfur-ing, followed by filtration through charcoal, which acts as a disinfectant. Fat, grasso, gra, father. I will say now that this defect should not be confounded with that of viscosity or greasiness, though at first view it might be supposed to be the same in a moderated form. The defect of fatness is rarely found in generous wines, but is usually confined to weak ones, and is not due, like greasiness, to a fermentation, but to the presence of a certain amount of albuminoid substances, of gum, mucilage, imperfect sugars, etc., which impart to the wine a character which, when it is tasted, leaves a more or less marked impression of something glutinous, an impression which persists for some time, leaving, as it were, a pasty feeling in the mouth. Fat wines are indigestible, and hard to keep during the hot season, as they are extremely liable to secondary fermentations. The wines in which this defect is usually found, are those grown on moist plains, which are naturally fertile, or made so by the addition of nitrogenous manures, as, for instance, young vineyards where the effect of manna-ing at the planting of the vines has not worn off. This defect may be avoided entirely, or to a great extent, by a thorough and prolonged aeration of the must, or by the addition of alcohol or tannin * to the wine. Sometimes this defect, when not too pronounced, will partly or wholly disappear after the wine has gone through its slow spring fermentation. Greasy, viscous, fillant, grassum, fillant, grace, father. Terms used of a wine which has lost part of its fluidity and which, when poured into a glass, falls without noise, or like oil, it has that viscid, mucilaginous look which reminds one of white of egg. This malady is caused by a microorganism. A greasy wine, as the malady progresses, loses its fragrance and becomes bitterish, its color becomes dull and tends to turn brown. Finally, it loses its natural transparency and brightness. At first it is flat, vapid, and distasteful, and finally, rancid and sour by the formation of lactic acid. The addition of a little tanninized wine is better than the direct addition of tannin. Tanninized wine may be prepared thus: take a small cask holding, for example, about 25 gallons, fill it with a strong wine, or one made so by the addition of 1 or 1*4 gallons of alcohol of 94 C. Into the wine put about 35 pounds of grape seeds which have not been fermented. For the first few days the wine should be stirred from time to time, and then left to itself. After about 10 days the liquid part is drawn off, and is then a wine heavily charged with tannin, which serves excellently for the purpose above noted. For that purpose a dose of 1 or 2 gallons of the tanninized wine to 100 of the wine to be treated is about the right proportion. If a tanninized wine is needed for the defecation of the must, it is prepared thus: take 5 gallons of alcohol and 10 gallons of wine, put in a small cask, and add about 18 or 20 pounds of seeds, and treat as in the former case. 1 or 2 gallons of this is sufficient to thoroughly defecate 100 gallons of must. If fresh seeds are not to be had, dry ones may be used, providing they are in good condition, that is to say, providing they have been dried in the shade, kept in a dry place, and have not become moldy. 54. Wine and the art of wine tasting. This malady occurs oftener in white than in red wines, in late years. However, it has been found often in red wines on account of the unfavorable conditions for the grapes attaining a complete maturity. Such, for instance, as the damages done by insects, cryptogams, and bad weather. It occurs easily, 2. In red wines made from grapes grown on very fertile soil rich in albuminoid substances. Very probably this deterioration is much more complex than is usually supposed. Pelago was the first to establish the presence of a microorganism, of a bacterium. Pasteur, later, demonstrated that this bacterium has the property of transforming the sugar that remains in the wine into a mucilaginous or viscid substance. Béchamp calls the active ferment of this process Micrococcus viscosus, and the gum which is formed viscoso. Tannin and alcohol, in certain proportions, prevent the development and action of this bacterium. The conclusion, therefore, is that wines poor in alcohol and tannin, and containing sugar, are subject, especially if white, to become fillant. This explains also the use of tannin, as proposed by M. Frangois, of Chalons, to arrest or prevent this malady. François attributes this malady to a peculiar nitrogenous substance, gliadin, a kind of gluten, which seems to have the property of being precipitated by tannin. Nessler affirms, however, that we do not know yet how the tannin acts. I have already remarked on the complex nature of the malady under discussion. Usually it is held to be owing to a lack or deficiency of tannin. This, however, is not invariably true, since Francisco Selmy has found it in wine made from Lambrusca grapes, and therefore rich in tannin. It seems that in this malady the tartaric acid also suffers changes. Probably on account of these changes Bizarri proposes the use of tartaric acid, 200 to 250 grams per 100 gallons, as a cure or preventive of the malady. The bacterium of La Grace put into a solution of sugar containing albuminoid and mineral substances acts upon the sugar and transforms it into a kind of gum, night, water, and carbonic acid. Thus, 100 parts of cane sugar will give 50.09 parts of night, 43.5 of gum, besides water and carbonic acid. Monod proposed to account for this transformation by two chemical equations, the first of which would give mannite and carbonic acid, the second gum and water, as formed from the glucose. Schmidt-Muhlheim is about of the same opinion, he believing that the viscous fermentation consisted of two processes, the first of which gave mannite and carbonic acid, and the second the viscid substance. Kramer has studied this ferment. He examined 3 wines afflicted by it, and besides Saccharomyces ellipsoideus, Saccharomyces mycodema, etc., he found an extremely minute Bacillus 2 to 6 / long, and .6 to .8 / j, thick. He failed to cultivate this bacillus on potato, agar, etc., but by putting a little of the infected wine into a new, 3 months white sterilized wine and with 3% of glucose, he found that the bacillus developed well and rendered the wine fillant, but only when the air was completely excluded. By covering the wine with a layer of oil with access of air, there was very little development of the bacillus, and instead an increase of the other ferments of the wine. Kramer has called this ferment Bacillus viscus vini. The peculiar kind of gum produced by the viscous fermentation of the sugar renders the wine viscid and glutinous. In its properties it resembles dextrin more than it does gum arabic. The viscid substance, according to Kramer, appears to be a product of assimilation of the organism, whilst the carbonic acid and mannite, which are formed contemporaneously, are products of the fermentation. A constant proportion between the first and the last substances does not exist. The bacillus multiplies very well in its own viscid product, forms a kind of glue. It has no acid reaction. Wine and the art of wine tasting. 55. The best means of preventing or arresting the disease consists of the use of tannin, pasteurizing to destroy the bacteria, racking into sulfured casks, and finally the addition of alcohol to the wine. Pasteurization is inapplicable in the case of white wines which are destined for the fabrication of champagne, because it not only destroys the bacteria, but also the alcoholic ferments, whose action is necessary to produce the carbonic acid, which renders the wine sparkling. At the beginning of the development of the disease, forcible agitation of the wine will restore its clearness and fluidity by the disassociation of the bacteria and the dispersion of the mucilaginous matter which envelops the parasite. Agitation, however, must not be looked upon as a curative measure. The results obtained are only temporary, for the cause of the disease, viz. the bacterium, is neither destroyed nor removed. Flat, wine flowers, vino svanito, svaporato, fiorito, vin. Evana evapor, flurry, father. A wine becomes flat when it remains for some time exposed to the air, as happens in an imperfectly filled or badly bunged cask. In time it becomes covered with wine flowers, which consists of the Saccharomyces vini, or Mycodema vini. In either case the wine gradually acquires an unpleasant, somewhat bitterish taste, and loses its strength and bouquet by evaporation, or else the breaking up of the alcohol into water and carbonic acid. This has been called by someone, on account of the products formed, hydrocarbonic fermentation, and is caused by the Mycodema vini, which attacks not only the alcohol, but very probably the ethers, succinic acid, and glycerin, as these bodies tend to disappear. Although cases do occur in which generous wines are attacked by the Mycodema vini, still it has a decided preference for young and feeble wines. In old and well-defecated wines it develops with difficulty, perhaps because in these wines the elements necessary for its nourishment, nitrogenous bodies and phosphates, are not found. The practice of some winemakers with regard to wine flowers is not in accord with that of those who follow a rational system of wine making. They consider only the development of the flowers which they look upon almost as a preservative of the wine, whilst the others sustain the necessity of energetically combating and preventing the increase of the flowers, because it is not only dangerous in itself, but is almost always accompanied by the Mycodema aceti, or Diplococcus aceti, which, the moment circumstances become favorable, commence to replace the Mycodema vini and cause the acetification of the wine. When it is thoroughly understood how the flowers act, it is easy to explain the facts put forward by those who do not consider it dangerous, and also the reasons of those who believe that it should be prevented by all means, and destroyed on its first appearance. The presence of the flowers causes such an absorption of oxygen and development of heat and carbonic acid, as to prevent the growth of any other organism. Duclio has calculated that 80 grams of alcohol contained in a liter of wine of 10% needs for its transformation into water and carbonic acid more than 160 grams, or 100 liters of oxygen. The conclusions to be drawn from this are evident. They are, that when the cask is well closed, so as to prevent the free entry of air, the diminution of alcohol, caused by the flowers is reduced to a mere 56. Wine and the art of wine tasting. Trifle, and that the presence of the flowers excluded the action of other microorganisms. We must not, however, reason from this that the Mycodema vini is really of use, for if exposure to the air should happen, if, instead of remaining white, the flowers as Pasteur noticed, should turn red, then, sooner or later, it will cede its place to other organisms, to the vinegar Diplococcus, which, as I have shown before, is ready immediately to commence action, finding itself in favorable condition for its development, for the flowers itself serves for nutriment, and if there should be a considerable rise in temperature, the conditions are the best possible. The final conclusion then, plainly is, that the flowers should be carefully guarded against. This is done by the strictest attention to filling up the importance of which was recognized by the poet Alman, when he wrote, Che nulla cosa pub medicar il vin, che restissimo. The flowers may be destroyed by the addition of sulphurous anhydride, or a few drops of alcohol. With wine in bottles, the development of the flowers is prevented by keeping the bottles lying down, if instead the wine is kept in flasks. /w, as in Tuscany, or in Demijohns, a few drops of the purest olive oil on the surface of the wine will have the same effect. Sour, pricked, acetified, vino di harpreso il fuoco, lo spunto, la punta, tu porto, vino acetoso, vin che apris la fu, viagrati, a. Acetic acid is one of the normal components of wine. It is formed during the alcoholic fermentation, but in such minute quantities as to be imperceptible to the taste. When the proportion of this acid, from one of the many known causes, becomes large enough as to be perceptible, then the wine is said to be pricked. A pricked wine retains its natural color and limpidity. This defect is recognized by the odor and taste of acetic acid. In tasting, its strongest effect is perceived at the base of the tongue. If a wine thus affected is not taken in hand immediately, and in truth success is not always sure, and treated with heavy sulphurings or pasteurizing, it soon becomes sour and acetic. Acetification is due to the action of a microorganism, the bacterium known under the name of Diplococcus aceti, still commonly called Mycodema aceti, which increases with a rapidity truly prodigious. Duclio tells us that if on a surface of wine a meter square an almost imperceptible amount of these bacteria is allowed to fall, in 24 hours, the whole surface of the liquid will be covered with a layer of them so closely placed as to be crowded into contact. Thus, there will be 300,000 million individuals formed in 24 hours. The rapidity with which the acetic bacterium multiplies explains why a pricked wine, when the temperature is favorable, becomes so quickly completely acetified. It should be remembered that whilst it is easy to prevent this disease by taking proper precautions in the fermenting room and cellar, it is difficult, if not impossible, to destroy it when started. Once a wine has become pricked, instead of trying to effect a cure, it is better to follow the advice of Guyot, who says, When wine acquires the odor and taste of acetic acid, it is sent to the vinegar factory, but it is never attempted to use it as wine. Wine and the RTFJ of wine TST, asterisk and 57. All the means that have been suggested for the treatment of a pricked wine may be considered as palliatives only, and not as radical cures. In this regard Carpen writes very justly. The neutralization of the acetic acid, which has developed in the wine by the oxidation of the alcohol with potash, soda, lime, magnesia, and their simple or double neutral carbonates and tartrates, seems to be a rational method, but, in reality, is not so. These substances neutralize wholly, or in part, the free, and even the combined acids, and the diminution of the complex acidity of the wine renders the acetic taste less noticeable, but does not completely remove it. To remove entirely the acetic acid, it is necessary to completely neutralize the wine, because the acetic acid combines with the alkaline and earthy alkaline bases after they have neutralized the tartaric, malic, and succinic acids. Moreover, acetic acid, even when completely combined with a base, gives out, though less strongly, its characteristic odor, so that even after complete neutralization the wine will still have an odor of acetic acid, accompanied besides by a bitter taste, which lingers in the throat, and may be worse than the first fault. Milk sour, lactic acid. This, by inexperienced tasters, is easily confounded with pricking or acetification. A milk sour wine has a more disgusting, biting, and penetrating acidity than an acetic wine, a harsh acidity, whose effect is felt long after the wine is swallowed. An acetic wine has a noticeable odor of vinegar, whilst a milk sour wine emits an odor of rancid butter, due to the butyric acid which almost always accompanies lactic acid. If there is any doubt as to which acid the wine contains, the doubt can be solved by pouring a drop or two of the wine into the palm of one hand, and then rubbing it with the other. If any acetic acid is present, its odor will be immediately perceptible on the hands. A milk sour wine loses some of its fluidity, and its color becomes dull. Sweet, badly defecated wines, especially those rich in albuminoids, are liable to milk sourness. The disease appears during the winter or in the spring, and generally in wines poor in acids. It is accompanied by a turbidity of the wine and a change of color. As long as the wine remains in full, well-bunged casks, this turbidity and change of color do not occur, but only when it is exposed to the air. Some observers have considered lactic acid as one of the normal products of alcoholic fermentation, like glycerin, succinic acid, etc. The truth, however, is, as Pasteur has proved, that whenever the smallest quantity or trace of lactic acid is found in wine, it is caused by lactic fermentation. Whenever the alcoholic fermentation of certain musts, rich in nitrogen, matters, is not well conducted, especially as regards temperature, a certain quantity of lactic acid is very easily formed, which is a bad defect. This happens generally in certain years in warm countries, where the so-called sweet sour wines are produced. It is difficult, not to say impossible, to take away the defect of milk sourness. The different methods proposed, including that of refermentation, do not succeed. Consequently, the best thing is to prevent it by a thorough defecation of the must, and a properly regulated fermentation. not allowing the temperature to rise to a point at which the alcoholic ferment becomes inactive, and thus preventing it from reducing all, or the major part, of the glucose contained in the must. 5. Return circulation. Department. Joe 202 Main Library. 300,948. University of California. Library. TTNJV.